Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 346, Apollonius of Tyana. Now, of course, Tyana, who cares? Link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books, blogs. This is by Albert Ravi, so this is someone who was fairly well regarded in his particular mid-19th century era when it comes to spiritual and historical topics. 53 pages, now so it is on the shorter side. It's extremely dense, and basically what it is a categorical sort of look at the entire life of Apollonius, from birth, of course, 1st century, up to his death, a contemporary of the creation of the story of Jesus. And this is probably, in the modern sense, what Apollonius is most notable for, which is that this book doesn't cover this as much, but there's one theory that the basic story of Jesus, and keeping in mind there is no fragment of any of the New Testament Gospels mentioning Jesus for decades after he supposedly died. That time period would have been roughly contemporary to when Apollonius had already begun his philosophical endeavors. So there are some people, they look at the stories. There are fairly well documented significant similarities. Of course, Philostratus being the one that mainly was writing about Apollonius at the time, following him around, and philosophers did this. Alexander the Great and all these others, they all had scribes following them, essentially. The idea was that, barring certain Eastern inclusions, Apollonius supposedly traveling through Persia, through the Indus region, or at least into the area that would have been populated by Hindus and other groups, certain mystics. He went, perceived wonders there, reported on them, in some cases omitted them because he felt that people wouldn't understand. I'm sure that some of it had to do with witch doctor, hoodoo, voodoo material. That's probably why it was left out. Like levitating tables and jars moving on their own. Apollonius, I think, was intelligent enough to not be fully taken in by such parlor tricks, and so that's probably why that section wasn't there, under pain of death, possibly. A little bit less enamored of certain Middle Eastern philosophical groups, actually, and appeared to have preferred those from the East generally. If you believe in the Essene origin of Jesus, or of at least the Jesus story, that would begin to make more sense too. He's rumored to have gone as far as that particular region. Again, there is potentially overlap, but it depends on which group of people you consult, because there's enough evidence to say it's plausible that the story of Apollonius was later adapted into the story of Jesus in the Gospels, that you've got these different retellings from the same progenitor source, but that progenitor source had been Judaized, essentially, from initially what had been the story of Apollonius, or something akin to that, probably with other elements and inclusions, which is why there's deviation in the 4 Gospels, of course. Is there one angel at the rock or 2 angels? The world may never know. That being said, while it's plausible, there's certainly not enough evidence to suggest that it's definitely the case. I'm amenable to the idea that there wasn't a historical Jesus in the gospel sense, and that what you're talking about is a transfigured version of Apollonius. Is this necessarily the case? No. Research continues. Of course, tomorrow you could find a New Testament fragment that comports to Matthew or Mark or something from 40 AD. So archaeology continues. That being said, I thought that the idea of him in the pagan revival sense in this particular book is more interesting. That is that centuries later, Apollonius is held up by the pagans as sort of the alternative to Jesus, which would be extremely funny if indeed Apollonius were the template from which Jesus was invented. In other words, the pagans had a form of philosophical revivalism well into the Christian era, and ended up in some cases, of course there were latter-day pagan emperors in Rome that actually practiced paganism, Julian the Apostate notably. Certainly there were other groups around Europe through time that were affected by the kind of philosophical paganism that would have been displayed here. The pagans, in the Roman sense, had begun to resurge. Of course, then you have more persecutions and witch burnings and all of these other terrible things, and then they continue, basically to this day. These days they burn books more often than they burn humans, but similar basic concept. I wouldn't be surprised if some people are rankled at the mere mention of Apollonius simply because a lot of the more skeptic side of people make declarative statements saying there wasn't a Jesus, it was Apollonius, and you stole the idea. I'm simply saying, based on the basic archaeological timeline, based on the basic similarities, which are pretty weighty, a lot of similarities between these two stories and the dating involved, it's plausible that Apollonius was the template that was at least used by certain New Testament authors. It could have been that there was a Jesus, but then all of these other oral legends got appropriated by Judaists and by the Essene groups, and they simply took basically the story of Apollonius because the pagans enjoyed the concept, and then transfigured it further. That is, there could have been a Jesus that got transfigured. There could have been no Jesus. Or it could be that the contemporary nature is coincidental. Could be that there's also perhaps some older story, maybe something that's been completely wiped off record. This can happen and wasn't spoken of, and that the stories of Jesus and Apollonius have a common origin. And this has happened many times within the human spiritual timeline. So, again, this is essentially from cradle to grave everything about Apollonius, as well as a fairly lengthy amount about what happens centuries later when you have a sort of pagan revivalism at times in Rome, especially in the Roman Empire, latter day before it collapses, among certain people. Again, using Apollonius in the most ironic manner possible, assuming the Jesus story is templated on it, basically having their own Christ, essentially, their own philosophical savior of sorts. Again, link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books blogs. That's about all. Peace out.